Jesus has been busy. He's been very busy. He has acquired some followers. He's been teaching. He's been preaching. A lot of healing miracles. He's done some other very cool stuff too. He's stilled the storm. He raised a child from the dead. He's been healing people, so many things, so many miracles. He's been so busy. And then he sends his followers out in pairs to be Jesus to others. And it goes very well. Things are going good. And they come back and they tell Jesus things have been going well. And so they go across to the other side of the lake to take a little time off, take a break. But as I'm sure you're aware, ministers don't get vacations. And on the other side of the lake, they encounter another crowd waiting. And so, of course, Jesus talks to them and he heals people and he preaches. He does the Jesus thing that he does. And it's late in the day and it's a big crowd. Everyone's hungry. So Jesus feeds them with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Yet another fantastic miracle. And just sidebar here, it doesn't matter, frankly to me, it doesn't matter whether you believe that the miracle here is that Jesus, with the power of God, took 5 loaves and 2 fishes and fed 5,000 people, or by demonstrating such an act of caring and sharing and love, by sharing all that was available with everyone in the crowd was inspired to do the same thing and suddenly found that they had little bits and pieces of things that they brought, a little snack, a lunch or something, and they all shared. Because frankly, that's a miracle too, isn't it? I mean, how often does that happen? It's a miracle. Right before that, in the Gospel of Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark drops in this little, it's a cutaway. Do you know a cutaway in television or in movies is when the storyline is going on and you're being introduced to characters or something's happening and then suddenly you're somewhere else. Right? And it's like one of those movies where the hero has been doing great stuff, and then suddenly you get a cutaway to the villain in their lair. They might be stroking their inordinately white cat, right? Or just drumming their fingers on the arm of their throne. Into the story, the author of the Gospel of Mark drops Herod, who has become aware of Jesus. That's how well things have been going for Jesus. He'd been so successful, and things had been going so well, Herod had heard of him. That would be enough to foreshadow things for later. But the author of the Gospel of Mark doesn't stop there. Instead, they tell the story of how John the Baptist died. Because it turns out Herod, whether he's just super superstitious or super not very bright, thought that Jesus was the ghost of John the Baptist come back. And so we hear the story of how John died. Again, it would have been enough for the author of the Gospel of Mark to say Herod had him killed, beheaded, taken out. Any of that would have been enough. But we get more. Why? Because we don't even hear how Jesus responds to that. Mark doesn't say Herod was aware of Jesus and Herod had killed John the Baptist, and when Jesus found out, Jesus was very sad. That's another gospel. Mark doesn't say anything about that. He just goes right back to the story. It is literally a cutaway from the main story, a sidebar. Why? Is my question. And I want to say, I really want to say that the point of hearing this horrifying story about John and about Herod and his family, I want to say the point of it is to be inspiring, that it's important to stand up and speak truth to power no matter what. And sometimes it costs you your life, but it's worth it. Because there's nothing in this story to indicate that it was worth it. Everything in this story indicates it was a heartless, vengeful, needless, senseless death out of revenge, out of spite, because somebody had the power to make it happen. And it turns out, too, by the way, that even speaking truth to power as John did, and losing his life because of it, that didn't seem to change anything right away. Herod continued being Herod. Herodias continued being horrid. And everyone continued on as before until, turns out, later on, Herod runs afoul of the Roman emperor, who sends him off to Gaul to die. And just pro tip here, if you're going to annoy a Roman emperor, don't make it Caligula, because he's nasty. Way worse than Herod. In fact, if you're interested in these family stories here, you should look up Caligula and just see how absolutely horrifyingly horrible he was. But also look up the Herodians, the Herodian dynasty. Herod the Great was the king at the time of the birth of Jesus. You know, the one that we have that wonderful story in Matthew about how he killed all the children? That was Herod the Great. This is Herod Antipater, who is one of Herod the Great's sons. He is married to Herodias, who was married to Philip, often referred to as Herod Philip, because Philip is this Herod's brother. But Herodias divorced him in order to marry this Herod, which is one of the things that John was speaking out against, because Leviticus, you're not supposed to do that. One of the things John was speaking out about. But if you're interested in the Herodians, you should look into them, because the Herodians make Game of Thrones look like a soap opera. They're horrible. They're brutal. They're mean. Herod the Great even was called the Great simply because he built some great buildings. He was brutal. And bear in mind that they only have power because the Romans let them. In fact, this Herod Antipater, wasn't actually technically a king. He was a tetrarch, which means he governed basically 2 regions in this area. One of those was Galilee, which is why he encounters Jesus. And John encounters him, unfortunately for John. But as fascinating as all that is, I'm sure, what's the point here? Why are we needing to hear this story? Again, I'd like to say it's inspirational. And in fact, at the very end of this little bit, this story, it does say that John's followers came to collect his body for burial, which would have been very brave of them. Very brave. Remember when Navalny, who was a critic of Putin, died in jail. Let's say died in jail. His wife and family came for the body, and people honored him. Like, people gathered to honor him. Imagine how scary that would have been. By the way, his wife has since been arrested. But it would have been really risky to do that. It would have been risky to go and collect John the Baptist's body from Herod too. So it's not like other people weren't inspired to stand up and say things, or at least be brave enough to honor the person who did. Okay, I don't see that as being enough to include the story, particularly when the story is so brutal and so senseless. Is it because the author of Mark is being a little sensational, wants to get your attention? Stories haven't been all that interesting so far. Let's throw something in like, no, because the stories have been fascinating. They've all been miracles. Jesus is a miracle worker. He has power. Okay. But there appears to be no connection between this story and Jesus. Not right away, anyway. Why put it here? Maybe that's the point. Not the story itself so much as where it is. Because right after this, Jesus feeds a crowd of people. It's a miracle. I wonder if maybe one of the things that Mark is trying to say, the author of the Gospel of Mark is trying to say, is that we live in a world where what happened to John the Baptist is an everyday occurrence. It might be sensational, might be a fascinating read, but it happens a lot. But somebody feeding a crowd of people is a miracle? Shouldn't that be the other way around? Shouldn't caring for others, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, shouldn't those be the everyday occurrences? And a story like the death of John the Baptist be something that stands out as being an aberration? Something that shouldn't happen? We want to say, yes, of course. But the fact is, we live in a world where we're often caught off guard by acts of kindness and generosity, of acts of love. In fact, we promote them as, isn't that amazing? And then in the next page, somebody shoots a bunch of people, and it's on the next page, because it happens all the time. I mean, how many people in the U.S. alone die from gunshots? Apparently in the U.K. it's a crossbow. Those kind of stories often don't get as much attention simply because they happen all the time. But an act of love, an act of extravagant love, radical love, an act of feeding people. A famous chef who quits his job and goes to work in a soup kitchen so he can feed people. That's a story we want to hear, because that's a miracle. The point of Jesus is that it should be the other way around. Acts of love and caring, how we build relationships with each other, should be the stories of every day. And the stories of those relationships being broken, the stories of hurt and pain, ought to be the occasional stories that get our attention, because we should do something about that. And our response to those stories usually tends to be things like thoughts and prayers with the family or the people adversely affected by this occurrence. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Thoughts and prayers are great. Prayer is awesome, as long as you remember that prayer needs to be accompanied by action. Because if it isn't, what has been the result of that occurrence, that moment when someone loses their life through hate, through revenge, through anger? And not just through hate and revenge and anger, but through the manipulation of someone else in order to make it happen. See, Herod may have power as the local tetrarch because the Romans say he can have power. He can even have soldiers. He has power and he uses it brutally. But he's not the power in this story, is he? The power in this story is with the person who's able to manipulate someone who manipulates Herod. Everything in this story is counter to what Jesus is all about. Everything. And yet, It's the stories that we hear if you even looked in the news this morning, it's full of that. It's just full of that. You have to look for the stories of love and care, because they're not the everyday occurrence. The world, the kingdom of heaven that Jesus wants us to build, that Jesus teaches us to build, that Jesus shows us we are capable of, is the one that surrounds this story. It's the moments of love and caring. It's the feeding the poor. It's the healing the sick. It's the speaking out on behalf of those who don't have a voice. It's standing up to people who are prejudiced, who oppress people, who exercise power over others instead of with. Those are the stories that we ought to be hearing every day. Now, again, it's not like the story of Jesus appears to end on a particularly positive note. And it would be really easy to point at this story of John the Baptist and go, see, that's what happens if you open your mouth. You shouldn't speak up because this is what's going to happen to you. And I'd like to say that that's a positive way to see this story. Is that even if you lose your life, it is worth standing up and speaking out. But if we could see that worth, if we could see that value as being the everyday occurrence, as being the real context of this world, that love and grace and care for the sick and the poor, if equity was the real worth of this world, I wouldn't need to tell you a story that was meant to inspire you because the person died at the end of it. If we lived the life of Jesus, not just the sacrifice part, but the life of Jesus, that should be our true inspiration. The life of John, what John had to say, John's job wasn't even to speak out like that. His job wasn't to be a prophet. His job was to say, here's Jesus. If we believed more in the life of Jesus as being what we are capable of, and if we lived that, imagine how different the world would be. When you read the news in the morning, it would be full of stories of love and grace and kindness. And every now and then, maybe, there might be a story of hurt and death, of someone speaking out and losing their life over it. But before it would be a story of somebody speaking out and standing up and saying what's right and being heard and things being done about it. Because we built a community where love and grace and compassion came first, not hate and vengefulness, not power over others. That's the kingdom that Jesus wants us to build.